What would you do if you discovered the humble girl everyone bullied and looked down on was actually the missing heiress to a billion-dollar empire who could destroy them all with a single phone call? Isabella Chen worked as a janitor at prestigious Heights University, cleaning toilets and mopping floors, while students in designer clothes walked past her without a second glance, treating her like she was invisible or worse, like she was beneath their notice. They had no idea that the girl scrubbing their bathroom floors was actually Isabella Vandermeer, the only daughter of tech billionaire Richard Vandermeer, who had disappeared 3 years ago after a family tragedy left her wanting to escape a world of fake people and empty privilege. She had changed her last name and taken the most humble job she could find because she wanted to know what it felt like to be treated based on who she was, rather than what she was worth. What she discovered was that most people revealed their true nature when they thought you had no power to hurt them. And the cruelest among them was Nathan Pierce, the arrogant heir to a hotel empire who made it his personal mission to humiliate her every chance he got, never imagining that the poor janitor girl he tormented would one day reveal herself as the woman who now owned everything he thought belonged to him. This is the story of a billionaire who pretended to be poor, and the people who learned too late that kindness costs nothing but cruelty can cost everything. Isabella adjusted her worn janitor uniform and pushed her cleaning cart down the marble hallway of prestigious Heights University, where tuition cost more than most people earned in a year, and every student came from families with more money than morals. She had been working here for 6 months, living in a tiny studio apartment across town, and taking the bus every morning, while her former classmates from Switzerland boarding school probably never gave her a second thought. Her father, Richard Vandermeer, had built a tech empire worth $3 billion, creating software that ran half the world's major corporations, but money had not protected her family from tragedy. 3 years ago, her mother had died in a car accident that everyone whispered was actually suicide, because living with Richard Vandermeer's obsession with business had driven her to desperation. Isabella had been 21 and studying at an elite European university when she got the news, and something inside her had shattered completely. She returned home to find her father buried in work, using business deals as a way to avoid grief, while their mansion felt like a mausoleum, filled with expensive things, but empty of any real human warmth. Isabella had tried to be the dutiful daughter, attending charity galas and smiling for cameras, while inside she felt hollow and fake, surrounded by people who only cared about her because of her last name and bank account. The final breaking point came at her 22nd birthday party that her father had organized as a networking event disguised as a celebration, where she overheard guests literally calculating her worth and discussing which of their sons should pursue her, as if she was a business merger rather than a human being. That night, Isabella had made a decision that everyone called crazy and ungrateful, but felt like the first honest choice of her entire life. She would disappear from the world of wealth and privilege and live as a normal person with a normal name, doing normal work to discover who she really was beneath the designer clothes and trust fund. She told her father she needed time away, and he had reluctantly agreed to give her 1 year to figure herself out, but made her promise to check in monthly so he would know she was safe. Isabella had chosen the name Chen because it was common enough that no one would connect it to Vandermeer, and she picked janitorial work specifically because it was the opposite of everything she had known. She wanted to be invisible, to experience what it felt like when people had no reason to pretend to like you or care about your opinions or treat you with basic human decency because you had nothing they wanted. The first month had been shocking in ways she had not fully anticipated, because Isabella discovered that wealth had insulated her from understanding how most people actually lived and thought. Her co-workers in the janitorial department were kind, but struggled with problems that seemed trivial to someone with billions, but were devastating when you lived paycheck to paycheck. Maria, the head janitor, was a 50-year-old woman who worked 2 jobs to support 3 kids, and spoke about a broken refrigerator like it was a catastrophic disaster because she could not afford to replace it. Tom, the maintenance guy, had not been to a dentist in 5 years because his insurance did not cover dental, and he just lived with constant pain rather than go into debt. These were good, hard-working people who treated Isabella with more genuine warmth than any socialite at a charity gala ever had, but they also existed in a reality where small problems could spiral into life-destroying situations. Isabella had to stop herself from solving their problems with money because that would blow her cover, but it hurt to watch people suffer over things that she could fix with what amounted to pocket change from her trust fund. She started to understand that privilege was not just about having money, but about having options and safety nets and the luxury of not having to worry about things that consumed people who lived without wealth. But the hardest lessons came from the students who treated her like she was part of the furniture, barely acknowledging her existence, except when they wanted to complain about something. Isabella cleaned their dorm bathrooms and mopped up their spills and emptied their trash while they talked on their phones about ski trips and yacht parties, completely oblivious to her presence, as if poor people did not have ears or feelings. Most of them were not intentionally cruel, just completely unaware that the people who cleaned and cooked and maintained their privileged lives were actual human beings with thoughts and dreams and dignity. But some of them were cruel and seemed to take pleasure in reminding her of her place in the social hierarchy. Nathan Pierce was the worst of them, and also the most confusing, because he was undeniably handsome with the kind of classic good looks that opened doors and made people forgive behavior they should not tolerate. He came from hotel money, with his family owning luxury properties across Asia, and he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who had never been told no or faced real consequences for his actions. For reasons Isabella could not understand, Nathan had singled her out for particular attention, in the worst possible way, making comments about how at least she had found work suited to her level and asking loudly if she needed help reading the cleaning supply labels, since poor people probably had not gotten much education. The first time it happened, Isabella had been so shocked she just stood there frozen, because she had never been spoken to that way in her entire life. In her real life, people competed to compliment her and sought her approval and treated every word she spoke like it carried weight and wisdom. But here, as Isabella Chen, the janitor Nathan Pierce, looked at her like she was trash he had to step over on his way to more important things. Her first instinct was to reveal who she really was and watch his face crumble with horror. But she stopped herself, because this was exactly why she had come here, to see people's true nature when they thought there were no consequences. What she saw in Nathan was something that both repelled and fascinated her, because his cruelty seemed to come not from stupidity, but from something darker and more deliberate. He was smart enough to know his words hurt, and rich enough not to care, and handsome enough that people probably excused his behavior as confidence, rather than recognizing it as the cruelty it actually was. Isabella decided to endure it as part of her education in how the world really worked when you did not have power to shield you from people's worst instincts. But enduring abuse was different from accepting it, and Isabella found herself studying Nathan with the same analytical mind that had earned her top grades at elite universities. She noticed that his cruelty increased when he was around his friends, as if he needed an audience to validate his superiority. She observed that he specifically targeted people who could not fight back, which was classic bully behavior, and revealed deep insecurity beneath his confident facade. Most interestingly, she realized that he seemed almost to be performing his privilege, as if constantly reminding others of their lower status was the only way he could convince himself of his higher one. Real confidence did not need to tear others down, but Nathan's entire personality seemed built on the foundation of being better rather than actually being good at anything meaningful. Isabella wondered what would happen if that foundation crumbled, and he had to face himself without the crutch of inherited wealth and manufactured superiority. She filed these observations away like data points in an experiment, knowing that eventually there would come a moment when all this information would be useful in ways Nathan could not possibly anticipate. 6 months into her experiment, Isabella had settled into a routine that felt almost normal, if she could ignore the absurdity of a billionaire scrubbing toilets by choice rather than necessity. She had made genuine friends among the janitorial staff who invited her to birthday parties and shared their lunches and treated her like family in ways that her actual wealthy social circle never had. She had learned skills she never imagined needing, like how to remove impossible stains, and fix broken equipment with limited resources and budget grocery shopping to make minimum wage stretch to cover rent and food. Most importantly, she had learned that poverty was not a moral failing or lack of ambition, but often just bad luck combined with a system designed to keep people trapped in cycles they could not escape without help. This education felt more valuable than anything she had learned at expensive private schools because it taught her empathy and humility and the understanding that human worth had nothing to do with bank account balances. But she also learned something darker about human nature and how quickly people revealed cruelty when they thought they could get away with it without consequences. The incident that changed everything happened on a Friday night when Isabella was cleaning the student lounge area after a party that had gotten particularly messy. Nathan and his friends were still there, drunk and loud, and she had hoped to avoid them by working quickly and quietly. But Nathan noticed her and apparently decided she would be his entertainment for the evening. He started making comments about how she must love her job since she got to clean up after her betters, and asking if she ever dreamed of being something more than a janitor, or if she was too stupid to imagine a better life. His friends laughed, and Isabella kept her head down, focusing on her work, and reminding herself that this was temporary, and eventually she would return to her real life, where Nathan Pierce would be nothing more than a cautionary tale about entitled rich kids. But Nathan was drunk enough to be bold and stupid enough to think there would be no consequences for whatever he did next. He grabbed her cleaning cart and tipped it over, spilling dirty water and supplies across the floor she had just cleaned, while his friends whooped and cheered like this was the most hilarious thing they had ever witnessed. Isabella stood there watching dirty water spread across marble floors and felt something cold and hard crystallize in her chest. This was no longer about education or understanding. This was about a cruel person who needed to learn that actions had consequences, even if those consequences came from unexpected sources. She looked up at Nathan, who was grinning like he had just won something, and she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. She pulled out her phone and did something she had not done in 6 months. She called her father's private number that only a handful of people in the world had access to, and when he answered with concern in his voice, because she only called during emergencies, she said 3 words that would set everything in motion. She told him it was time to come home, and that she needed him to acquire something for her as a welcome back gift. Richard Vandermeer asked what his daughter wanted, and Isabella looked directly at Nathan Pierce and smiled. She wanted him to buy the Pierce Hotel Group, and she wanted it done by Monday morning. The phone call took less than 2 minutes, and Nathan had no idea that his entire world had just been purchased by the janitor girl, whose evening he had just ruined for entertainment. Isabella finished her shift working around the spilled water that Nathan's friends eventually got bored of laughing about, and she went home to her tiny apartment one last time. That weekend, she transformed back into Isabella Vandermeer with the help of stylists and tailors, and the kind of people who could make someone look like a completely different person. On Monday morning, she walked into prestigious Heights University, but not through the service entrance she had used for 6 months. She walked through the main entrance wearing a custom Chanel suit that cost more than most people's cars and heels that clicked against marble with the sound of power and money. Her hair was professionally styled. Her makeup was flawless, and she wore the diamond necklace her mother had left her that was worth more than the entire annual budget of the university's janitorial department. She looked like exactly what she was, which was one of the richest young women in Asia, and someone who could buy and sell everyone in this building without noticing the expense. The reaction was immediate and chaotic, with students and staff staring and whispering, because Isabella Vandermeer's disappearance 3 years ago had been major news, and speculation about where she had gone had filled gossip columns for months. Isabella walked directly to the dean's office where her father was waiting, because Richard Vandermeer had flown in personally to handle what he called his daughter's reintegration into society. The dean was falling over himself with apologies for not recognizing her, and assurances that if he had known her true identity, she would never have been allowed to work in such a demeaning position. Isabella smiled coldly and said that was exactly the problem, because her identity should not have mattered when it came to basic human decency and respect. She told him that she had spent 6 months observing how his prestigious university treated the people who kept it running. The dean went pale because having Isabella Vandermeer as an enemy was not something any university could afford, given that her family donated millions to educational institutions and had the influence to destroy reputations with a single interview. Isabella let him sweat for a moment before explaining that she was not interested in destroying the university. But she was very interested in addressing specific individuals who had demonstrated the kind of character that reflected poorly on the institution's values. She asked the dean to summon Nathan Pierce to his office immediately for a matter of urgent importance. 20 minutes later, Nathan walked in looking confident and curious, probably thinking he was being called in for some award or recognition, because people like him assumed every summons was an opportunity rather than a reckoning. He saw Isabella and his brain clearly struggled to process why a stunning woman in expensive clothes was in the dean's office until she smiled and said, "Hello, Nathan," and used the same sweet voice she had used when cleaning his messes. His face went through a remarkable transformation from confusion to recognition to absolute horror as he realized that the janitor girl he had tormented for 6 months was standing in front of him, looking like she had just stepped out of a Forbes magazine cover shoot. Isabella let the silence stretch while Nathan's mind clearly raced through every interaction they had ever had and all the cruel things he had said and done while thinking she was powerless. She watched him realize that he had not been tormenting some poor girl with no options, but had instead been revealing his worst self to someone who had the power to destroy everything he had ever taken for granted. Richard Vandermeer, who had been watching this scene with interest, introduced himself as Isabella's father and casually mentioned that he had just completed the acquisition of Pierce Hotel Group over the weekend. The company that Nathan's grandfather had built and his father currently ran, and that Nathan was supposed to inherit now belonged to Vandermeer Industries. Nathan physically swayed like he might faint, because this was not just about personal humiliation. This was about his entire future and family legacy being purchased like a commodity. Richard continued in that calm, businesslike tone, explaining that the Pierce family would remain as managers for now, but ultimate control and decision-making authority now rested with the Vandermeer family, and specifically with Isabella, who had expressed interest in learning the hotel business. Nathan looked at Isabella with something like pleading in his eyes, as if she might somehow save him from consequences that were entirely of his own making. Isabella tilted her head and asked him if he remembered what he had said to her about finding work suited to her level, and whether he thought cleaning toilets or running hotel empires was more suited to her particular skill set. The dean, who had been silent during this exchange, started to sputter something about misunderstandings and youthful mistakes, but Isabella cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. She said there was no misunderstanding about cruelty, and that Nathan had shown exactly who he was when he thought there would be no consequences. She told Nathan directly that she had 2 options for how to proceed, and he should listen carefully because his entire future depended on the choice she made in the next 60 seconds. Option 1 was that she would fire his father as manager of Pierce Hotel Group and install new leadership, while Nathan would be publicly exposed for his treatment of staff and blacklisted from every major corporation in Asia through her family's extensive network. His reputation would be destroyed, and he would spend the rest of his life explaining why Isabella Vandermeer considered him unworthy of basic professional courtesy. Option 2 was that Nathan would spend the next year working in every entry-level position at Pierce Hotel Group, including janitorial and housekeeping and kitchen staff, where he would learn what it meant to be treated the way he had treated others. At the end of that year, if he demonstrated genuine growth and understanding, then Isabella would consider allowing him to remain in the family business in a junior management position, where he would have to earn every promotion through merit rather than inheritance. Nathan, who probably had never worked an honest day in his life, and certainly never cleaned a toilet, looked like he might vomit at the prospect of option 2. But he also understood that option 1 would destroy not just his future but his family's reputation and business. Isabella waited patiently because this was not about vengeance but about teaching someone who desperately needed to learn that privilege was not a right but a responsibility. Nathan asked in a voice that shook slightly what guarantee he had that she would honor her word if he chose option 2. Isabella smiled and said he had the same guarantee she had when she was cleaning his messes and enduring his cruelty, which was to say no guarantee except faith that the other person possessed basic integrity. She pointed out that the difference was she actually possessed integrity, while he had demonstrated none, but perhaps a year of humility would teach him to develop some. Nathan looked at his shoes, which were probably worth more than a month of Isabella's janitorial salary, and said quietly that he would choose option 2. Isabella nodded and told him to report to the housekeeping manager at the flagship Pierce Hotel downtown on Monday morning, and to not bother mentioning his family connection because she had already instructed management to treat him exactly as they would any other new hire. After Nathan left, looking like a man walking to his own execution, the dean tried to laugh nervously and suggest that Isabella's revenge was perhaps excessive. Isabella turned to him with an expression that made him stop mid-sentence, because there was nothing soft or forgiving in her eyes. She told him that this was not revenge, but education, and that if the dean had created an environment where staff were treated with respect, Nathan would never have felt entitled to treat her with cruelty. She announced that Vandermeer Industries would be making a substantial donation to the university, but it came with conditions including mandatory respect and dignity training for all students, and significant improvements to working conditions and pay for janitorial and service staff. The dean agreed immediately, because refusing Isabella Vandermeer when she was offering millions would be career suicide. Isabella spent the next week working with her father and his team to implement changes that would actually protect the people she had worked alongside. She made sure Maria got a management position with health insurance that covered her children, and Tom got dental coverage and a raise, and every single person who had shown her kindness during her time as a janitor received opportunities that wealth and connections could provide. But Isabella's transformation was not just about revenge or redistribution of resources. It was about fundamental change in how she understood power and responsibility. Working as a janitor had taught her that wealth was not earned through merit, but largely through luck and circumstance, and that people who had less were not less deserving, but simply less lucky. But largely through luck and circumstance, and that people who had less were not less deserving, but simply less lucky. She decided to use her position in ways that actually mattered, rather than just attending charity galas and writing checks that were She took a genuine role in managing Pierce Hotel Group and implemented policies that made it the highest-paying employer in the hospitality industry, with benefits that actually supported workers and their families. She created training programs that allowed housekeeping staff to move into management positions if they showed aptitude and interest. Most controversially, she instituted a policy where anyone in management, including herself, had to spend 1 week per year working in entry-level positions, so they would never forget what the work actually entailed and how it felt to be treated as less than human by people who thought themselves superior. Nathan Pierce spent his year working through positions he had never imagined doing himself, and the experience broke him down in ways that were probably necessary if he was ever going to become a decent human being. Isabella received monthly reports about his progress and heard that he struggled initially with both the physical labor and the emotional toll of being treated with the casual disrespect he had once shown others. But somewhere around month 6, something seemed to shift, and Nathan started actually engaging with his co-workers and learning their names and stories, and understanding that these were complete human beings rather than background characters in his privileged life. Isabella watched this transformation with interest because she had not been sure if someone as fundamentally entitled as Nathan could actually change, or if this was just an extended performance to get back into her good graces. She decided to find out by making an unannounced visit to the hotel where Nathan was currently working in the laundry facility, doing work that was hot and repetitive and completely unglamorous. She found him sorting linens with 2 older women who were teaching him the proper folding technique, and chatting with him like he was just another co-worker, rather than the heir to the hotel empire. Nathan did not see her watching from the doorway, and she observed as he joked with the women, and actually seemed to be enjoying their company in a way that looked genuine, rather than performative. When he finally noticed Isabella, his expression shifted through several emotions, including residual shame, and something that might have been gratitude. She asked to speak with him privately, and they stepped into a storage room that smelled like clean laundry and industrial detergent. Isabella asked him directly what he had learned because she wanted to know if this year had been growth or just clever acting. Nathan was quiet for a long moment, and then said something that surprised her with its honesty. He told her that he had learned he was a terrible person who had been enabled by wealth and privilege, and that being forced to exist without those advantages had shown him how fragile his entire identity had been. He said the hardest part was not the physical work, but realizing that people he had looked down on were actually better humans than he was, because they treated others with kindness, despite having less reason to be generous. Isabella studied him, trying to determine if this was genuine transformation or manipulation, but his body language and tone suggested real remorse. She told him that his year was complete, and he could return to a junior management position, but with the understanding that he would be monitored, and any return to his previous behavior would result in permanent termination. Nathan thanked her quietly and asked if she would ever be able to forgive him for how he had treated her. Isabella considered the question carefully because forgiveness was complicated when someone had revealed such ugly parts of their character. She said that forgiveness was not something she could give or withhold, but rather something he would have to earn through consistent behavior over time. She told him that she had learned during her time as a janitor that people revealed their true selves when they thought they had power over others, and that the real test of character was not how you treated equals, but how you treated people you perceived as beneath you. Nathan had failed that test spectacularly, but perhaps he had learned enough to pass it in the future. She extended her hand and Nathan shook it with a grip that felt less entitled and more genuinely grateful for a second chance he probably did not deserve, but had been given anyway. Over the following months, Nathan worked his way back into the family business, but with a completely different approach than his previous arrogant trajectory. He advocated for staff interests in management meetings and pushed for policies that prioritized worker well-being even when it cut into profit margins. Isabella watched this evolution with cautious approval, because actions over time mattered more than words spoken in moments of desperation. But something unexpected was also happening, which was that she and Nathan had developed a working relationship that occasionally felt like friendship, or perhaps something more complicated. They had both been transformed by her decision to pretend to be poor, and his unwitting participation in teaching her how cruelly people could behave when they thought there would be no consequences. They understood each other in ways that went beyond typical workplace dynamics, because they had both seen each other at their worst and most vulnerable, and somehow were finding ways to build something better from those foundations. 2 years after Isabella revealed her true identity, she stood in the penthouse suite of Pierce Hotel Shanghai, looking out at a city that glittered with millions of lights representing millions of lives, most of which struggled with challenges that wealth could solve, but rarely did. Nathan joined her by the window and commented that the view was beautiful, but looked different once you understood that each light represented a person rather than just aesthetic decoration. Isabella smiled because this was the kind of observation the old Nathan would never have made, since he saw people as background rather than individuals with their own complete lives. She asked him if he regretted the year he spent working in positions he had once mocked, and Nathan said honestly that it was the hardest and most valuable year of his life. He said wealth and privilege had insulated him from understanding how the world worked for people who did not have safety nets, and that losing that insulation had been painful, but necessary for him to become someone worth knowing. Isabella felt something shift in her chest, because this vulnerable, honest Nathan was someone she actually respected and maybe even cared about in ways she had not anticipated. Nathan turned to face her and asked with genuine curiosity why she had given him option 2 instead of simply destroying him as he probably deserved. Isabella was quiet because the answer was complicated by her own journey and understanding of power and mercy. She told him that revenge would have been satisfying for about 5 minutes, and then would have left her feeling empty, because destroying someone did not actually build anything or teach anyone, including herself, anything valuable. She said she had spent 6 months being powerless and learning what that felt like, and she had decided that when she returned to having power, she wanted to use it differently than people had used power against her. Breaking Nathan would have made her just another wealthy person who crushed others for personal satisfaction, but giving him the opportunity to become better meant she was using her privilege to create growth rather than destruction. Nathan looked at her like she was something extraordinary, which was ironic because 6 months ago, he had looked at her like she was beneath his notice. He told her that she was the most remarkable person he had ever met, and that he did not deserve her consideration, but he would spend his life trying to be worthy of it. Isabella felt her heart do something complicated and dangerous because falling for Nathan Pierce had never been part of any plan or experiment. But human connection did not follow logical paths, and sometimes the people who taught you the hardest lessons were the ones who ended up mattering most. She told Nathan that she was not sure what they were building between professional colleagues and something more personal, but she was willing to explore it carefully and with clear boundaries. Nathan agreed immediately and thanked her for even considering the possibility that he could be more than the terrible person he had been when they first met. They stood together looking out at Shanghai, and both of them knew that their story was unusual and complicated, and would probably be criticized by people who thought Isabella should have simply destroyed Nathan rather than given him the opportunity for redemption. But Isabella had learned that life was more interesting and meaningful when you allowed for complexity and growth, rather than reducing everything to simple narratives of good and evil. Nathan had been terrible, but had become better, and Isabella had been privileged but had become conscious. And together they were figuring out how to use their combined resources and influence to make small differences in a world that desperately needed people with power to actually give a damn about people without it. 5 years after Isabella revealed her identity, she stood on a stage at a conference about ethical business practices and told her story about pretending to be poor and what she had learned about privilege and power and human nature. She talked about how wealth created blindness to others' humanity, and how the only cure was actually experiencing life without that wealth even temporarily. She shared that the best business decision she ever made was not a merger or acquisition, but rather implementing policies that treated workers as complete humans, deserving of dignity and fair compensation. The audience of business leaders listened with varying degrees of comfort, because Isabella's message implied that many of them were complicit in systems that extracted value from workers while giving nothing back. She did not soften her message because comfortable lies helped no one, but uncomfortable truths had the potential to create real change. After her speech, Nathan, who was now a full partner in their combined business ventures, and also her fiancé, joined her backstage and told her she had terrified at least half the audience, which meant she had done her job correctly. Isabella smiled because the girl who had pretended to be poor to escape privilege had become a woman who used her privilege to advocate for people who had no voice in rooms where decisions were made. She had learned that real power was not about control or dominance, but about creating opportunities and protecting vulnerabilities and using resources to build rather than simply accumulate. Nathan had learned that inherited wealth meant nothing without earned character, and that the respect that mattered came from people who had no obligation to give it. Together, they had built something unusual, which was a business empire that prioritized people over profit margins while still being wildly successful, because it turned out that treating workers well actually improved every metric from productivity to loyalty to innovation. They proved that ethical business was not just possible, but potentially more profitable than exploitative models, though they would have maintained their principles even if it cost them money, because some things mattered more than quarterly earnings reports. Isabella had started her journey wanting to escape privilege and had ended up learning how to wield it responsibly, which was perhaps the only way that wealth could ever be truly justified.